collaboration with Center for Learning Futures. And we believe in a different kind of education at Ahmedabad University. And that's why we have been trying to invite people from different domains to discuss topics which are very relevant and that can benefit all of us. And we also invite people from outside as our listeners who can contribute and participate in our webinars. Today's webinar is, as I said, really special because I am again from communication area and there are a lot of people from writing program. We do this job, but this problem of writing affects all of us, and not only the writing but critical thinking, and we have seen how it has been affecting students and teachers and the academics for a long time. So thank you so much for joining us, particularly on Saturday. Just to quickly introduce today's expert, Professor Durba Chattaraj is an assistant professor of anthropology, and she is the first director of writing at Asoka, and she was the one who began this writing center at Asoka. Prior to joining Asoka, Professor Chattaraj was a senior fellow in the critical writing program at the University of Pennsylvania for 5 years. At Penn's Writing in the Disciplines program, she worked with a team of colleagues to develop and enhance the university's writing curriculum and pedagogy. She also taught popular writing seminars on informal economics, the politics of development, legal anthropology, economic anthropology, global foodways, and South Asia studies. While at Penn, she specializes in working with international students and English as a second language student as they develop their academic writing and research abilities. And we are grateful to Durba for doing this webinar today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And the person who will be in conversation with Professor Durba is Professor Ashwin Kumar. He's the director of Center for Learning Futures at Ahmedabad University, and he's also a professor in communication area at Amrut Mody School of Management. He has more than a decade of experience in teaching and research in cultural studies. He has worked in higher education grant design and policy review, alongside being a literary and academic translator. His research interests are primarily in philosophy of culture, cultural theory, and conceptual history. And his work particularly addresses questions related to the philosophical landscape of the issues involved in the study of human cultures. Ashwin has also worked at the higher education cell at the Center for the Study of Culture and Society, Bangalore, where he was heading the regional language resources initiative involved in enhancing the use of Indian language resources in higher education, as also the digital footprint of Indic languages. He was associated with Sir Ratan Tata Trust, Mumbai, as a consultant for their higher education portfolio. So thank you, Ashwin, for doing this. Before I hand it over to you, there are certain rules. Except both the speakers, all of us will be muted, and those people who are joining with their mobile, we request you to rename yourself, because we request you to also put your questions while these people will be in conversation. And that will be helpful for us to kind of put your questions and curate and ask you to appear on camera if that is okay with you. So that's all from my side. I request Ashwin to take it forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudhir, and thank you, Durba, for this wonderful opportunity you've given us to interact with you. A couple of anecdotal stuff to begin with. Every year when we conduct the review of our university's work, the one section which really gets a lot of time and a lot of engagement and attention is the writing program here. So the writing program is probably the most reviewed, I would say the over-reviewed program in the university. It says something, it really points to a problem which bothers everyone. The other is something which might not be of a great source of surprise for most of us, but when we tell people that we have a writing center and we teach writing, most people are aghast. I mean, they're surprised to say the least. They're like, so what is that? Like, I can understand physics and history and sociology, but what is it to teach writing? I mean, we didn't do that. Sometimes they're very appreciative of it, and most often they're just sorry for you. But you see, there is a way by which writing has emerged as some kind of a symptom for the problem for the many problems in education that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So here is an opening question for you to help us think through this. we all seem to agree that there is a problem related to reading and writing and comprehension. But what's the diagnosis for this problem? What is this problem really about? Because the moment we talk about diagnosis, you see that there are various ways in which one can cut the cake. One can say, in the post-internet world where attention spans are very low, writing skills are dwindling. People don't have the old world patience to go through long form prose, either reading it or writing it, and you will want bite-sized information. There are other people who would say that what's actually happening is more and more disadvantaged students from disadvantaged backgrounds are entering higher education, and because they're from disadvantaged backgrounds, they don't have the natural advantage that students would have had if they would have gone to private schools and things like that in the country. And therefore, what you're calling bad writing skills is actually an inverted index of the fact that higher education is expanding demographically, and that's a good thing. So instead of figuring out what you can do about this, we are just sitting back and complaining about some lack that's there in our students. Mm-hmm. And then there is a third, rather skeptical way of looking at it, which is, who cares about writing today, really? Meaning, unless you're a person interested in fine writing, literary interests and things like that, isn't writing really an overrated skill? You would rather learn how to deal with Excel sheets or with numbers and graphs and data. Why are we emphasizing on writing so much? So, the mind boggles really if you were to try and figure out what's a good diagnosis of the situation. What do you think? How would you want to address this issue? How would you want to think about this issue?
No, thank you so much, Professor Kumar, for this excellent question. And thank you everyone for inviting me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to think with all of you. This first question that you posed got me thinking a lot. And I actually, in terms of diagnosis, I don't know that writing skills are necessarily dwindling. I think that there are not enough places where writing is taught, so that kind of surprise as to what are you doing when you teach writing? I don't think that the K through 12 education system really has much place for writing. And I'm talking about both elite schools and schools which are, supposedly for underprepared or underprivileged students. So I went to Sardar Patel Vidyalaya, which is a school in Khan Market. So it's at sort of the heart of the Khan Market set. I had underwent a CBSE education. And I just remember never writing pieces or barely ever writing pieces that were not under timed writing conditions or for exams. So, you can go through this supposedly really elite education, get to 12th grade, and you haven't really practiced writing, certainly not revision, certainly not drafting. So it's sort of like disappeared from the curriculum, and a longer historical understanding, I think, is really essential here. This is among the many projects. One that I would really like to do is understand a history of writing education in India, because people of my parents' generation had composition classes in high school, and they had composition classes in vernacular languages. So my mother went to a Malayalam medium school. She had composition. One of my colleagues, Professor Sri Ramachandran, who went to college in Coimbatore, he was stunned when he heard that I'd never taken a composition class. So it's sort of fallen out of the curriculum in many boards, not all. And I think it needs to be reintroduced. It's going to be replaced with language exams, which don't do the same thing at all. So I don't know that skills are dwindling. Another thing that I think reading skills are dwindling, but not writing skills. So one of the things I do as a professor of writing is I sort of stalk Quora and Reddit, which are meant to be, taken over by Indian engineering students, and you'll see that students are writing these incredibly long answers to real world questions that, interest them. Now, the questions might be a little ridiculous. So there are, pages and pages of answers about Katrina Kaif's ancestry, for example. Maybe that's not the best, place where students should be focusing attention, but they're writing these pretty complex pieces, looking at evidence, piecing them together. So maybe somewhere we're also not engaging students at their level of interest, but they're writing all the time on Facebook, Twitter, Quora, Reddit. There's a complaint on Reddit that, a bunch of Indian engineering students have taken over the forum, which is, I don't agree with that complaint at all. So I think that students are writing all the time. We need to tap into that energy. The question of disadvantaged backgrounds, I think that, it's really exciting that we have so many more students from underprepared backgrounds entering higher education, entering the humanities and social science disciplines, and learning to craft the narrative about the society that they live in. And I think that if we see, one of the things that you learn when you do writing program work is you make a distinction between higher order and lower order concerns. So the higher order concern is definitely the thinking and the reasoning and the ideas that are behind a student's writing. And the lower order concerns are, the grammar, the article errors, the prepositions. Those are things that you address last, if at all, and I think that that's really interesting in the Indian context, because I was very much trained in that way in America, where if you had a student from China, from India or Nepal, you wouldn't sit and do a long conversation with them about their grammar. Instead, you would talk about their ideas, how to push an argument forward, what is innovative about what they're thinking. And when grammar and English became a lower order concern, you'd find amazing thinking and amazing ideas. And I think we at writing centers are very cognizant of that, but we need to push that across the universities, where what we're really looking for is thought. And grammar is secondary. It's almost, if the student is intelligible, what's the big deal? It's almost the sort of, the kind of flippery that's on top of it, but it's really not essential. And I just, wanted to read a little piece of a section from an astoundingly beautiful essay by Ashwin Pare, who's now an assistant professor of English. And he wrote this last year. He is from Kashmir. His father was a carpet weaver, and he managed to make it through school and get his master's and eventually PhD in English. And this essay is really, I think, indicates some of the problem with writing here. And I won't go on with this answer for too long, but I did want to read this piece. It's a small section. So this is, again, Professor Pare. In the biology exam, they asked a very simple question. How are vegetables dried and used during winters in Kashmir? I knew the answer. I had helped my mother on many occasions to dry out tomatoes and bottle gourd slices on a tin sheet during the summers, but I didn't know enough English to express it on the answer sheet. I mustered courage and managed to write some words in a chutney of English, Urdu, and Urdu-fied Kashmiri. First we get vegetable, and then you cutting it tukre tukre. I wrote a note at the end. Sir, please pass karna. Jawab aata hai magar English nahi aati. I beseech you, sir, please mark me pass. I know the answer, but I don't know English. When I checked my results, I showered a bucket full of blessings to the evaluator who had understood my agony. So, I think that this is a real problem. And when we say people are writing badly, we are not giving them the place to write about what they know in the languages that they know. And I think the more we accept sort of the chutnified language, the more we accept thought rather than sort of, grammar and the kind of, almost Shashi Tharoorian approach to English, the more we will have students writing extraordinary things and really changing the narrative. And over here, not only is Professor Pare's essay achingly beautiful, but I really do also want to bless the examiner or the evaluator who read his work with different eyes. So instead of saying, what nonsense is this, he was able to get to that deep cognitive problem in Indian education where you don't allow people to express their knowledge because of all of these other gaps. So that's that question. Right. I think it's quite a very exciting moment for Indian education, actually, like immensely exciting. And then the last thing, who cares about writing today? Excel sheets, the sort of elevator pitch, writing should be about numbers and quantities. I would say that, at Penn or other elite universities in America, this is not really a debate because they know that sort of the good numbers, the exciting report, the good Excel sheet and the good analytical abilities come after almost you have the ability to basically organize and synthesize information in logical and argumentative ways. So it's sort of a no-brainer to have a writing program that every first year takes, a writing seminar that every first year takes, whether they're engineering students, medical students, etc., because it really is a way of thinking, a set of dispositions, which then allow you to understand anything in the world. So it's almost the base position from which we start. So,
right.
Thank you. I've gone on for a while.
No, I think that there are many interesting points here. So I'll just I'll just pick on one of those things that you mentioned earlier on in your response, which is really about the design of a writing program in all of these many institutions you've been part of across continents, really. Can you spend some time helping us, taking us through the construction of a writing program in some of the better places you've been and in some of the not so efficient models that you've seen?
Yeah. Absolutely. And, again, I'm speaking here in broad generalizations, and I'm sure you and many of my colleagues have correctives and things to add. But broadly speaking, writing programs in the US, which is where I was first trained. So I was an anthropologist trying to find a tenure track job in anthropology. And I sort of fell into a writing program at the University of Pennsylvania. And for the first year, I was trying to get back to anthropology. I was like, where have I come? And then I realized that I love this work. And probably this is the work that I find the most exciting and that I'm the most passionate about. So I think the US has a very unique relationship to writing programs in that they realized that everybody coming to college, particularly the big state universities where students might be first generation learners coming from agricultural backgrounds, not having gone to elite universities, everybody who comes to college needs a basic understanding of the skills of reasoning, critical thinking, and writing in order to proceed in their disciplines, which they weren't getting from high school. And so they began to craft these first-year writing programs across universities. And in fact, they're more popular and have longer histories in the big public universities where you're more democratic, right? And a much shorter history in the elite universities. So Yale, when I went there for my PhD, they didn't really have a very structured writing program. Now, Penn, you could argue, is a little bit more democratic in terms of how the IVs are set, and they really believed in this writing program and leveling the playing field. It's the first leveling the playing field. So when you look at the responses from the students to the polls, which are very poignant, we don't know how to paraphrase and quote. We weren't taught how to answer the question. That's why we might plagiarize. We weren't prepared for the assignments that we were asked. So there's a first-year course which across the board prepares students for these things. Now, what should go into that course? How it should be taught? Should it focus on English? Should it be part of an English department? Is it across the disciplines? There is as much debate in that as there is in any field. So the field of Redcom, writing studies, pedagogy, it's a pretty fascinating field in America and very debate-driven. I think that it's a very new and emergent field in India, but a really exciting one because we've sort of landed because we've started later in a more progressive position where we tend to loosely, I would say, all of us at our different writing centers, we're comfortable with multilinguality. We don't insist on this relationship to English as the home of writing programs. We're comfortable with multidisciplinarity. We're comfortable with students of different backgrounds coming in and working with them. So I think that we've actually started in a more progressive place in some ways than the US system, which had its own history. But I think the elite universities have also caught on because this type of preparation, it's not just required for students from underprepared backgrounds. Even students from elite high schools do not have enough practice in coming up with original work, in writing original pieces. You actually need a whole lot of training, you need mentorship, you need conversations in order to get there. And so I think that first year writing seminar is essential, not just for our private universities where we've sort of been I would say, the lead on this, but for universities across India. If you do that, you level the playing field, you'll see plagiarism go down. You'll see a lot of changes very quickly if you just tell students how to put together a paper, how to make an argument, how to paraphrase, how to quote, how to look at the world around you. So I think broadly speaking, that's the design of a writing program. The first year writing seminar is essential. Then you can have specialized seminars for more advanced writers. And of course, you need a solid bridge program in India. Bridge programs in India should be really, really advanced for students who aren't English speakers if the university is English medium. And I think there we can learn less from the US because the US tends to have this, TOEFL bias, right? You have to pass the TOEFL in order to come here. So you have to know this much English to get here. So someone like Shakus and Pare would maybe not have got into the master's program there. We can bring students into the master's program and within a year, 2 years, English becomes another language. It's not such a, difficult thing to pick up, and you work with it with your own vernacular language and don't make this big hierarchy. But I think Turkey, Boğaziçi University, a lot of universities which have longer histories of, both very strong non-English writing and reading and also English, they have really good bridge programs, so we can learn from them
Right.
rather than the US. Yeah.
Right. I think that's an interesting point, that, that we have a certain leapfrogging advantage in certain areas which we should really be focusing on. There was also another connection which was coming up again and again, and this is probably a very natural connection, which is between the idea of writing and the idea of reflecting, critical thinking. That it seems like we are talking about two sides of the same coin here when we're talking about a particular variety of reflex in our thinking and writing. Now, it's very hard to keep this together, the writing and the thinking together in some contexts in education. Now, there are certain disciplines, I'm not going to name them because we know who we are talking about. If there are colleagues here, raise your hands. Where, the assumption is, listen, all of that writing, you guys take care of it. It's important to get the technicalities of the matter sorted in this particular course. It's hard to argue against such a position, but you also know that one can't let that argument be as it were. Yeah. So how have you seen the relationship between writing on the one hand and critical thinking on the other, especially when it comes to the issue of disciplines? Is it like the more humanistic disciplines will eventually have to do the heavy lifting for writing skills across a university, and one just accepts the fact and moves along? Or have you seen models where other disciplines have brought in an equal amount of energy and investment in the question of writing, to the question of writing?
That's a beautiful question. And I think that everyone who works with writing in India, but to some extent anywhere, feels, are we, there's this expectation that the first year writing seminar, specialized writing seminars should take care of reasoning, critical thinking, grammar, citation in every discipline forever and ever. And it's not possible for that one seminar to do. So how do our allied disciplines then take up the question? Definitely in the humanities and social sciences, it's a natural fit, right? Because if you just allow a social sciences class to not be exam-based and to be paper and writing based, you can see how students will build upon the skills that we have prepared them for in a first year writing seminar. And it works quite well, when you shift the mode of assessment from exam to turning in papers, even if it's a mix also. So there's some papers, some exams, some group work. Now, what happens with the more scientific disciplines, I think in the Indian context, is it really depends on the orientation and pedagogical ethos of the professor. And this is not in any way to critique, the sort of formidable expertise of the sciences in the Indian context at all, but to suggest that there might be ways in which pedagogy could be shifted a little bit, right? So I have a colleague in psychology, Professor Shimantini Ghosh, where her assignment for one of our more advanced classes is that students write a research paper, or they write a full research proposal. Sorry, not a paper, because you need the results there. So that is an entirely writing-based exercise. It's something that goes through all of the different stages of, Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. She could have also assessed that material as exams. But instead, she assesses it as this long-term project where you put together a research proposal which will actually pass muster as much as possible in actual graduate level work in the discipline. So it's a writing exercise from beginning to end. Students use the writing center. They use a lot of the skills that they used in their first year, but now they have to put it in conversation with the discipline. So I think that the more that disciplines in the sciences also shift their assessment practices, the more you'll have these natural connections. An exam is not the only way to assess knowledge. In fact, it's a pretty poor way to assess knowledge in many disciplines. In America, what I've noticed in the United States, and I'm not positing it as a perfect education or pedagogical system at all. There are many flaws, but I'm just saying there's certain things to pick up. this distinction between sort of writing as a humanities and science-based thing is not as extreme. Of course, it's becoming more extreme now, but there is an idea that the first year writing seminar is essential. Engineering students at Penn take another writing seminar within the engineering department to figure out how to write. Medical students are required to take 2 writing requirements, so this split is not as extreme because there's a lot of writing in the sciences, in technical schools in the US. And I think that if we can incorporate that more into the pedagogy, it won't just be the heavy lifting of the humanities and social sciences, nor should it be, because, again, it's an excellent exercise to put together a research proposal in your second year. You won't be perfect. I think the question of expertise becomes very important. You won't maybe have the expertise to be perfect, but you learn a process. Yeah. And that process is, based on process-based learning rather than content-based perfection, which an exam typically tests. They're 2 completely different things. The more we focus on process, the better things will get, I think, for students in India. And the pickup is amazingly fast. If you explain to students a little bit the process, you'll find things like plagiarism drop. You'll find things like, that feeling of, oh my God, I've been assigned a 30-page paper. I've never written a paper before. What do I do? That panic goes away. You can actually teach these things slowly, incrementally, and students pick up really well. So, yeah.
Right. I think I have an interesting anecdote to share here from just a couple of weeks ago from one of my advanced writing courses. That's the doctoral writing courses. We had a case of what I'm now calling reverse plagiarism. So one of the things our students do in the course is write an entire mature wiki entry.
I love that. I've read that wonderful article. Yeah.
Now, what happens is there are, as you would know, many mirror sites which keep a copy of whatever goes onto the Wikipedia in their own in their own pages. They're sort of semi-legal mirror wikis. I don't know what's the purpose of these kinds of sites. Maybe there's a lot of data processing going on in the back end, using this kind of information. Who knows? But the problem is that then when you run it against a plagiarism checker, Wikipedia treats it as plagiarized material because it's coming from somewhere else. And one of our students, we flagged this, and I didn't know the backstory. I just said, okay, here is some plagiarism problem. And because the student had really invested so much time and energy writing that article out, he got really mad at me and said, don't ever question my work ethic. First, understand the process. So I got a proper dressing down, and I was very proud to be, having a student such as that who will tell me that don't question my work ethic, because I've put that hard work in, which really is revealing. I mean, it sort of supports the claim that you're making, that once students get to write this kind of original stuff, the sense of ownership on writing really increases. On
beautiful story.
on that front, just a quick extension now. You have written on connecting the discipline of anthropology and the skill of writing. Now, you have a very interesting claim to make about how there is some kind of a co-constitutive relationship between the kind of work anthropology is and the kind of thing writing is, because both involves probably making an artifact, right? In writing's case, it's writing. In anthropology's case, it's creating a field from out of really disparate practices and rituals and whatever. Now, can you tell us a little more about this connection? Because I think for all of our viewers here today in the webinar, this might be something more than of interest simply because it's about one discipline and one skill. I think what you're saying might have more general lessons for many such disciplines and many such skills. And therefore, I would want you to spend a little time detailing out the connection that you're trying to focus in this paper.
Oh, thank you so much for that question, which also really got me thinking. And I think that there are 2 things when I was reflecting on this question. The first is the preponderance of text in Indian society when it comes to writing, So I think that because I fell into a writing program from a training in anthropology, it seemed to me that anytime anyone was thinking about writing, they were thinking about writing from text, about text, of text. So whether it's history, whether it's English, even sometimes whether it's sociology, you're sort of working with what's already written on the page. And I think my training in anthropology really was the opposite of that, where it was, the world is the text, the society around you is the text, what you're looking at, culture as text is famously sort of what Clifford Geertz put it as, right? And so this ability to look around at the world around you is really, really important in the Indian context across disciplines, I think, because what happens in India is that, the poet Akhil Katyal has this beautiful poem about, daffodils in, growing up in India and reading all his poetry about daffodils and never seeing a daffodil in his life. And we have different flowers. I'm paraphrasing terribly. So I think that what happens with the preponderance of text, and no disrespect to my colleagues in literature or history, where text is the only source of knowledge, right, is that so many of our texts are not of our context, right? It took such a struggle to even get Indian writers included, for example, in the DU English syllabus many years ago in the 90s. So many of our texts are not of our context that we know very little about our context, I think, in that we don't look at it analytically. And so very simply, I think when I connected writing seminars with Anthro, the main connection for me, and the main argument in the article is that anthropologists should teach these first-year writing seminars, because we know well, and anybody can learn this, the method of lived experience being a legitimate mode of constituting knowledge. It doesn't have to be printed in a book for you to reflect on it, think about it, write about it, analyze it, reflect it, think critically about it. It can be everything that's around you. And I think that this really has been... it's the thing that I'm the most passionate about in the Indian context, because there's a real lack of it, I think, to some extent. And in the US context, maybe there's a preponderance of it, where everybody is sort of always writing from experience, and the first person narrative essay is such a big, part of the pedagogical system. So I think that connecting anthropology, it's less about the discipline of anthropology, but more allowing students to write about the social, political, and personal worlds that they live in and reside in can really lead to something very beautiful and very powerful in the Indian context. So, Akhil Katyal's poem is an example of that. I think also there was recently a little essay by a 8-year-old child that went viral about puttu, this, South Indian rice dish. And this 8-year-old student did this little essay which everyone resonated with. And I just remember thinking, it's amazing that you're reflecting on the food that you're eating every day and thinking about it. Do you like it? Do you dislike it? And we're talking about an 8-year-old. Obviously, this isn't a college level essay, rather than sort of what you're reading about in an Enid Blyton novel, which was always, jam cakes and God knows, ginger schnapps and all of that. So I think that the more your local immediate context is the basis of writing and knowledge, the better it is. So just decentering text, I think, is the most relevant part of that article. And we can all do it all the time. So a writing exercise that I give very often is for students to write 5 sets of field notes about the world around them. Just observe it carefully with that anthropological eye. And it's amazing what emerges. I'm often amazed by it.
That's interesting. Now, connected to this is something I've noticed on YouTube, when you're looking at these educational videos or straightforward lectures on particular topics. Particularly to do with the more scientific, so-called hard disciplines. I noticed that most of these highly watched videos from India are from great lecturers, people who can stand there and explain a lot of stuff very well for long hours, an hour or 2 or 3 at a stretch. Mm-hmm. And the ones which are really watched a lot coming from the US or UK or other contexts is a physics professor, taking a huge pendulum or a ball-like thing to the class, an iron ball of, I don't know, half a ton or something like that, and crashing it against himself and telling students that if his physics works, his nose will not be broken because the ball is going to stop an inch away from his nose, and then doing the equation and showing why he does this. And it's interesting that long years ago, I think it was Arindam Roy Chowdhury, the IISc physicist, who wrote about his experience of being a physicist in India, a physics student in India and a physics student in Chicago, where something like this was happening. That to quip, the Indian students got the gold medals and the American ones got the Nobel Prizes. Yeah, and gold medals are given for cracking exams, and Nobel Prizes are not given for cracking exams. They're given for building better theories. And you're saying, what is that gestalt, as it were, of thinking and doing, which is so different there that one can initiate oneself into a culture of scientific inquiry. It's not simply about the presence or absence of a good institutional infrastructure. What's more important is this learning gestalt is something he was trying to push for. And probably there are shades of that kind of thinking in what you're trying to say too. On that front, a quick point about the part of the title which really caught most of our attention, which is Ratta. I did think about this, but my colleague Supratim raised an interesting question. Does it have some relationship to rote learning? Well, now that he has asked that question, it's worth really pondering about whether rote and Ratta are the same. Now, there's a certain value placed in many traditional systems of knowledge to memorization, right? Which is not the same thing as rote learning. There are certain models of education where probably mastering a corpus is an important first step in then going forward to manipulating it or thinking through it and things like that. I was told the American literary critic Harold Bloom had this peculiar quirk. He would say, you want to do PhD with me, you will have to have learned by heart about at least 500 to 800 master poems of the English language. And people thought he was being crazy. Well, probably he was, but he was saying something slightly more interesting than simply saying, ratify the 500 poems and come to me, but that there is a certain kind of emphasis placed on memory as an important aspect of learning. But the contrast might also be interesting, which is that in all of these traditions, memory is really memory of certain core constitutive rules and not lists of facts, right? But somehow in the modern system, the older habit stays of memory, but the material has changed. And so you're doing what you should have done to probably a bunch of mantras or whatever, or sutras. You're doing that to a textbook on Indian history, which is an absolutely wrong method to bring to a wrong set of things. So I was wondering, in this context, how would you really want to sort of think about the problem of Ratta?
Yeah, I think absolutely fantastic question. And what's really interesting is probably the people who ratta the most in their career never complain about it. So if you think about an actor, their entire role or job is to ratta, right? They rattify the dialogue, they come prepared to the set, they speak their piece. You've never heard an actor say, oh my God, I hate my life so much, I'm just rattoing, because they know why they're rattaing, right? So the sort of rote memorization has a larger purpose, which is very clearly defined, without which the entire system really can't work, right? So if you're sort of always looking at your script, you can't act, and you're part of an actor in a larger piece. In the same way, when you talk about traditional knowledge systems, I have a student who's doing a undergraduate thesis right now on different learning systems in Bharatnatyam, of which she is a dancer and she's been dancing since she was 4, and the kind of education she got in school, and really contrasting those pedagogical systems. So much of what she learned in her more traditional knowledge system is based on repetition, memorization, learning a kind of body of knowledge really well bodily in this way. Before you try to even begin to improvise, you learn your out-of-syllabus, you learn so much through memorization. And there's no resentment on the part of the student for that, because you understand why. And like you said, it works with the kind of knowledge that needs to be produced. The memorization is part of it. The problem emerges where you have students broadly in a post-enlightenment kind of field. Modern education is really, it's part sort of enlightenment questioning and part, industrial education. It's a weird tension. It's a mix of, we want to produce docile factory workers, plus we want to produce questioners who are citizens who can, take on enlightenment values. And so it's this weird mix where, like you say, you're learning history, or you're learning English, and you're learning sort of languages in the humanities without questioning. So I think that's where students begin to really resent it. And this really came to light for me when I would teach Kant's What is Enlightenment, right? That simple essay that he wrote to popularize Enlightenment concepts for the general population. And I would show it in India in the 2022, 2021. And students would read it. And the kind of gist of what is Enlightenment is dare to know, right? Dare to question. And there Kant is saying horrible things about, the church and the tax collector and the state in some way, except for Friedrich, who is great, of Russia. He's saying these really horrible things about church, state, tax collector as oppressive institutions. When students in India would read it today again and again, the first thing they would identify as the oppressive institution was schooling, the place where they were not allowed to know. So it's really very strange that we are an enlightenment, sort of enlightenment education system, broadly speaking. We're not in a traditional mode of knowledge impartition, but we've imported some of the more high-handed parts of the enlightenment tradition. There's one knowledge, there's one way to know things, but not the reasoning itself. So the reasoning is not core to, we've imported a tradition of reasoning, and the reasoning is is removed. Because where actually are you sitting and reasoning out in K through 12 education? Maybe in the earlier stages, but when the board exam pressure shows up, you're just memorizing. And these are questions that you should actually be thinking out. You take away the time constraint, you give students group work, and you can figure out the answers to these, but the point is to memorize. So it's a really strange dissonance that students deeply resent because they can't see the point of it. And indeed, if we think back, I can't see the point of so much memorization that I did. It produced no enduring understanding. And it's not like being an actor in a play or learning my Bharatnatyam out-of-syllabus, or even learning like classical music or learning even Sanskrit shloks. It's the, and this is, of course, we could go into Macaulay. This was intended. And I think we haven't done enough to excise Macaulay's vision of us as imitators and mimicry artists, right? We've done it somewhat, but not enough. There's a radical kind of excising to be done. And I hope that we'll all do it.
I think that's really the last part was the important part. In fact, I remember this, not just the text-based memorization. The problem runs deep, probably. I used to be a student of the sciences in my 11th and 12th. Most people say, oh, you complain about it, and that's why you got out. You don't know how to sort this out. But I think I have at least half a legitimate complaint, which was even in the laboratories, when you were trying to understand something hands-on, what was happening was really a rote experiment. There was some kind of a tube with a little, air bubble in between, and you're supposed to hold the tube left and right and get the air bubble into the center. And the moment you get it to the center, you write down a little reading, make a little note of a reading, or you mix two salts, and the moment it turns whatever green or whatever blue, shades of green and blue, you note down your now, to what theory was this evidence? Or to what hypothesis or conjecture was this counter evidence? No one had the first clue. So my famous Ratta equivalent of the chemistry lab is, when all those pipettes and burettes are being switched on and off. One of my faculty members in chemistry had this thing. He said, he didn't know how to explain exactly how you should be using that thing. He said, hey, listen, don't do that like, tuck, 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 tuck. Just do it like tuck and tuck and tuck. So that's all we got to know about chemistry. Meaning, so the idea of education as constructive of knowledge, that is, in some senses, theory building, not in the negative sense that it is acquired today, but in a slightly more serious sense, that explaining phenomena, disparate kinds of phenomena, and unifying your experience through explanations, that seems to have really gone off the curriculum.
Absolutely.
Yeah? And I don't think it's a problem of one or the other discipline. It is not even a problem of labs versus theory classrooms, because all these examples I gave you were from labs. The problem seems to be slightly deeper. Would you want to reflect a little bit on your own experience countering this universal solvent called the Ratta culture?
Yeah, again, so much to think about and keep thinking about. But yeah, I think, I love the Wikipedia exercise that you do for your students, because it shows them in such a concrete way how knowledge is constructed, right? Even in an encyclopedia entry, which is the ultimate in sort of, it's given to you and you memorize it, right? Or you learn it. But to be in the process of constructing an encyclopedia entry is just such a, cognitively such an important thing for a student to see how much debate, how much sort of work goes into constructing that which is produced as just consumption in a textbook, right? So I think assignments like this, at some level, it seems like a really tough problem to address, and at another level it's really easy. Like when you did the assignment with the Wikipedia and the students, and it was a successful assignment, right? Students understood how knowledge is constructed. They learned how to construct a knowledge entry, right, rather than just rectify it, right? So instead of saying, I want you to answer a question on I don't know, the revolt of 1857, how do we make even that encyclopedia entry? How is knowledge constructed? So I think if you craft the right assignment, students take to it like, I don't know, moths to a flame. That's not a very good metaphor, but they take
fish to water.
Yeah, because that's destruction. They take to it so well, with such intense engagement, that constructing the right assignment really kind of rectifies this very quickly. And students tend to almost always prefer the construction of knowledge than the Ratta, except that there's risk in the construction. So the Ratta has certainty. That's why the mode of assessment is the most important thing. I think if it's an exam and one exam and everything rides on that, you can't risk not ratifying or being a rattu tota. There's so many wonderful words around this, right? Because you need those marks. Everything is tied to that. And so you can't take risks. You can't work with failure. I think that failure needs to be an intrinsic part of any education system that's enlightenment based, but actually any education system. It's okay to run an experiment that fails. You learn so much more from that failure. It's okay to write a paper where you want to, demonstrate some outlandish theory in 700 words, like, I don't know, students have had things like, monogamy is absolutely something that should be thrown out immediately. And in 700 words, they want to prove this definitively. It's okay to not be able to do that also. It's okay to fail a lot and fail often. But for that, you have to take out the risk. If you take out the risk in assessment, you'll automatically find Ratta dropping away. So I think constructing assignments, so often I show students Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. I've just printed it out.
Yeah.
And students themselves, this is the anthropologist in me, So this is a kind of pyramid of education, hierarchically ranked. So students will always say that, oh, we only did the lower levels. We only did understand and remember. We never got to analyze or create in our entire 12 years of educational experience. And I find myself playing devil's advocate and saying, you must have done a little bit of evaluation, a little bit of creation. No, they just refuse to say that their educational experience involved anything beyond those two base, sometimes the third application. And then they ask, why didn't we? Why weren't we? Why weren't we asked questions that asked us to create? Why weren't we taught this in school? And I have enormous sympathy for students, for teachers in K through 12 education in India, because you're teaching to a syllabus and an exam system that's so rigorous and so intense that you don't have a choice for a lot of creativity. But if you just create the creative assignments, the students just take to them, and it's kind of easy to rectify. Out of syllabus, changing syllabi in India takes its own gargantuan 20-year time. So that's the difficulty we have, I think.
Yeah, maybe there's a lesson for all of us here, which is, let's first attack the evaluation piece, because that's at least something one can begin sorting. I think I should probably ask you my last question and then hand it over to Sudhir to collect questions from our audience, because we are probably running out of time. And as you know, this is a problem of life and death, mostly death. So we will really have a lot of things to say. But right now, just a quick question on this rather slippery problem of teaching critical thinking. This comes from my own personal experience of deep love and deep hate for this, because I think I teach it very well, but I'm not. But whoever else I see teaching it, I have great complaints about. But that may be just the teacher in me. We love the teacher that we are. The teachers that we are, but here is the more serious version of the problem, which is to say that, you see, you could learn physics purely as a set of canonical statements, or you could learn it as a set of constraints, a set of explanations, challenges, questions, methodological allowances and disallowances, logical gates which are closed and open. You can learn physics like this. Now, learning it the second way is the critical way of learning physics. And this must be true for every single discipline, whether it's history, architecture, cooking, whatever. Now, what outside of that would be critical thinking that can be institutionalized and taught in some kind of an instructional mode? Shouldn't critical thinking really be the correct style of teaching a subject and not a subject itself? That's one extreme version of the situation. The other thing is to say, well, there is critical thinking, which is to just go through all the logical fallacies that people commit in their argumentation, and to sort of give you a survey of these kinds of fallacies, of various kinds, formal, informal, whatever kinds of fallacies. Where would you place your, glider in this spectrum?
Thank you for this. This is a tough question, which also partly I don't necessarily have the tools to fully answer. I think this is really a question for our colleagues in the sciences in liberal arts universities, which are making these big kind of moves to rethink learning and rethink how we teach. But to me, it's very much, what you said about critical thinking being a mode of teaching and learning. It's an orientation rather than the subject itself, right? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I don't think, and this is from speaking with many colleagues who are scientists, I don't think that there's this split where it's sort of, appropriate for some and inappropriate for others. It's a mode of knowing and learning and teaching, and so anything can be taught in this manner, right? But I think it's the question of expertise does become very important. So, for example, from what I understand, and please scientists correct me and also think about this in your own pedagogy, which I'm sure you do. You need a certain level of expertise before you can engage in the critical processes in the sciences or in mathematics, which is a language in many ways, right? You need a certain level of expertise, which you can access that expertise earlier on in the humanities and the social sciences, right? Not in a very professional way, but at a sort of base way. If we think about the history of the Western tradition, which we inherited in a complex way, the Renaissance comes before the Enlightenment. So you have sort of, questioning in general, as a historical moment of everything, predating the kind of precise construction of scientific inquiry that we've inherited in our modern kind of tradition. So I think that if there's a sort of base of questioning as a mode of teaching and learning, it can extend across the disciplines. But that said, I don't, you mentioned lectures earlier, and you did mention, the importance of a certain level of knowledge precepts to start a conversation. I don't want to throw that completely out, the baby out with the bathwater. I think lectures get really bad rap, but I think a really good lecture can actually do a lot for a student as long as they understand why they're taking knowledge in a more passive way and learn to apply it maybe outside in a discussion section or with problem sets. So of course, there are bodies of knowledge that students need to know, and that they need to maybe take in a more passive way. But as long as it's in dialogue constantly with other ways of thinking and questioning, I think that's a happy mix. I don't want to completely throw out the sort of deep field of knowledge or set of premises you need to make critical interventions in a discipline.
Right. I think that's a very hard and difficult balance you've asked us to follow, but I think that's a very valuable point to make. One last question probably. You spoke about your experiences in the US and India, about the writing programs themselves. Would you have some similar experiences to share with us relating to the students you have seen in the US university context and the Indian university context? Even when the US context might have a very multiracial, multi-ethnic student mix, would the milieu make a difference?
Yeah, this question is an exciting one for me because it sort of allows me to talk about how amazing it is to teach in these ways in India. Because in the US, so for example, my daughter is currently in school here, and she's 7 years old, and she'll come home from school and say, Mom, can you help me work on my personal narrative? And then next week we're going to write short pieces on the world around us. So she's 7 and this is what she's getting to do. So by the time a US student in a kind of good public school, these are free public schools, and of course there's a lot of problems with the US education system. By the time they get to college, they've had too much of a good thing to some extent. Like they've been doing like science fairs and critical thinking and essays and, projects. So they're just kind of a bit like jaded. It's a plethora of witches. You get to a classroom in India where you have students who basically, and I was one of those students, right? We've been rattaing for 12 years under a lot of pressure. And it's not the fault of the teachers, it's the syllabus, right? So you've been memorizing. And then suddenly you get a classroom where a professor is like, create, talk, evaluate, analyze, work in groups. There's no exam, or the exam is a very small component of your grade. You can do a project which, you can take Shakespeare and reinterpret him for the current century in any language that you want, as opposed to we will test you on what Othello said in verse whatever, So it sort of opens the world. And I think that the classroom in India for me, because I've taught in both and at great universities in both spaces, and also in done workshops in less elite universities where I don't see a difference in the quality of the students are amazing everywhere. It's like a great unfettering. So we have this amazing opportunity in India right now where students are, if you open up the classroom, if you have a more creative and innovative classroom, students are just bringing their A+ game. You almost, people would leave Ashoka, at the end of the day saying, I'm so exhilarated from the class. And I haven't had that feeling. at the University of Pennsylvania, that'll happen maybe once a year, you know. At Ashoka, it would happen every third day, and Ashoka is not an exception there. So I think we have this amazing opportunity to unfetter from the strange legacy of Macaulay and the pressure of the exams and the 99% and that mode of just extreme pressure for very little value, because the Ratta doesn't serve that larger purpose which it may for a Bharatanatyam student learning Hardovers. So I think that it's an opportunity. This is such an exciting moment, and across disciplines, the more we can open up our classrooms, the more will happen. It's just more exciting to teach in an Indian classroom at this moment for me than a US classroom, because they've just got so much of this type of pedagogy that they're trying to figure out, you know, what to do next, and we have so little. So yeah,
right.
And I think the question. I think I went off.
No. I think. Yeah. And probably, you know, in more than a couple of your points, you have really mentioned how these newly emerging universities in India, I mean, it so happens that they're also private universities, but I don't know if there is some kind of a constitutive relationship as to why they are necessarily so, or it might just be so that that might be the case, or that there may be other interesting public universities also, which public, maybe not universities, but institutions like the ICERs and all of them, where some exciting work might be happening across the country. Probably one of the things one needs to really be thinking about is building coalitions across these kinds of institutions, because like most disciplines have built some kind of a, you know, inter-institutional coalition where, despite the fact that your particular institution you're working in has these many constraints, you can still make do because you have resources that you can laterally share, if not physical resources, other intellectual resources. So maybe what you are really hinting towards is kind of exploring this field, you know, this nascent and emergent field. And I suppose, for lack of any better alternatives, we get to do the heavy lifting, which we should only be thankful about. And I'll stop there, Durba, with my questions, because it's really something that's very close to our hearts. But we should really, you know, I think we can talk about this for long hours, which we should outside of this conversation. But let me ask Sudhir to collect a few of our audience's questions, because I see that what's also interesting is the chat box has a very interesting alternative line of questions, or more than questions, comments going on, which actually shows how real thinking works. It works laterally, it works parallelly, right? So Sudhir, over to you to help us with the rest of the sessions. And thank you so much, Durba, for this.
Thank you so much, Professor Kumar. This was just an exciting conversation and so much to do. Like you said, we could talk about this for much longer, but would love to take some audience questions between the both of us, actually. Yeah.
Thank you so much. In fact, I would like to invite Sapan Oza, because he has a very core question, and he would like you to answer that. So Sapan, if you can switch on your camera and ask that question.
Yeah, I have unmuted myself. Just give me a second for the camera. Hey, good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, maybe a brash question. Let me qualify that first. Why is academic writing so boring? I mean, being in the industry and having a love for academics, I seriously cannot get past the abstract part of any research paper. And part two, maybe a follow-up to that. I mean, you guys are in the hot seat, as Amitabh Bachchan would call it, KBC. But what can be done to make it more accessible or interesting? You know?
Yeah. You know, Professor Kumar, also please, your thoughts as well. I'll take the question because I think about this a lot. So in my discipline of anthropology, there's a lot of writing that is just not accessible for a wider public. It's actually written for experts in the field. So it's an audience problem where the writing is not outwards, but inwards to 5 experts who work in the same field. And so I think that really it's an act of translation. Just as you have translators who translate from Hindi to Bengali, Gujarati to Urdu, all of that, we need translators who take specialized knowledge and can write for broad audiences within a discipline. Now, earlier, there used to be many, many academics who did both, but I think there's a certain kind of, push in academia to publish or perish, which has a certain, negative, which is that you're publishing in journals, you're not writing for a wide audience. There's very little reward for that. But so we've seen a real decline in terms of figures like Clifford Geertz, even, who could write to 6 different audiences in my discipline, or Margaret Mead, who used to write, weekly columns in Ladies' Home Journal for broad audiences, and she was critiqued for that. Or even popular science writers, right? There are popular science writers who are not scientists, but that person who's both the academic and the popular writer, they're fewer. In some ways, as we hyper specialize, it becomes harder and harder. So I feel like each discipline should figure out a way to reward people within the practice of the knowledge who write to wide audiences. Because it's like, if you made a scientific or intellectual breakthrough in a field and nobody knows about it at all, did you make the breakthrough at all, right? But yes, a lot of it, if it's not well done, is excruciatingly boring. And my students ask me this all the time, and I don't really have that much of an answer. It's that niche audience, I guess, but your point is taken. Yeah.
But was there any specific discipline that Sapan Oza had in mind he wanted to target? We would love to.
No. See, Professor, I agree. See, I am trained as a marketing specialist. And I go to a lot of colleges as a visiting faculty. Along with the bread and butter, that is the industry that pays me. Okay. Somewhere that disconnect, I am finding it getting bigger and bigger as we go down the line, and what industry wants. So maybe, okay, let me give a thoda tangential example. Maybe the McKinseys and the E&Ys of the world, if we read their white papers, are a crossover between a very, very bubblegum kind of writing vis-a-vis a hardcore academic writing. So maybe the Gartners or the McKinseys of the world, they have technical stuff, yet they are accessible. So that was the gap. That is the gap I'm looking to address, maybe, right, in my small way, whatever way I can.
Right. Yeah. But I think the only silver lining in all this is there are many instances, I think, where very fine academic writing is also very finely written. There are not many such. It's not the majority. But it just goes on to prove that if you want to do it that way, you can do it that way, probably. It's not an impossible task.
Yeah, it comes down to intent then.
Yeah. Well, and the kind of institutional constraints that Durba was talking about. In fact, sometimes probably it pays to be incomprehensible,
You are telling me. No, point taken. It's this discussion just makes you gobble down cups and cups of coffee, but you don't have an answer to this. Never. Yeah,
let's solve it right here, beginning in Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sapan. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Professor Pandey. Thanks.
Now I would like to invite Tarun to switch on his camera and ask the question. Tarun. Tarun, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So hi, everyone. Well, I'm Tarun. I tutor at a non-profit platform called schoolhouse.world. And what we do is we connect the world. Our audiences are primarily high school students, and we connect students with free peer-to-peer tutoring across a variety of disciplines. People, I actually wanted to ask you, Professor Chattaraj, about do you think the peer tutoring that we offer, online peer tutoring over Zoom calls, which is free and non-profit, do you think this can help somehow remediate undergraduates who go through the rote learning model in high school and come to first year college and they're blank in humanities classes because they don't know how to write an original argument? Do you think something like this, a bit like those JEE after school coaching, but better, of this peer tutoring for remediating in this basic writing and reading and critical thinking skills would probably help students fill in gaps? I mean, it's not a substitute to writing centers, I mean, writing programs in colleges, but do you think this would be a good way to help those who been rote learners in high school at least catch up to the rigors of college and thrive in college and help others thrive?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fascinating to know about, what you work on. It's called Schoolhouse dot.
Schoolhouse. I'll share the link in the chat.
Yeah. No, I think that in this regard, if we're doing the kind of exorcism of a loosely inherited Macaulay-esque Ratta model that we're all talking about and sharing here for more creativity and innovation, let a million flowers bloom, And so I think that because syllabus change in India, we all know, takes such a long time and is such a fraught process, it's a political process, a lot of jugaad out of formal education, pedagogical solutions will have to be found. And peer-to-peer learning is such an important way to go about it. I don't even know if the term remediation is necessary, because it's not like fixing something that isn't there, but rather a place for dialogue, for learning, for having a conversation with others. And actually, peer-to-peer learning is really important in this regard, because the exam mode is very solitary. It's you, what you know, and what you reproduce. Getting to a peer learning mode where it's you, what you're thinking through together, and what you're co-producing is really important. I want to point to another one of the assignments in Professor Kumar's class, where I think for your second assignment, students work together with argument and counter argument together, right? So an important proposition that needs to be debated, and you're working rather than opposing each other in the debate model. You're trying to figure out sort of how to think about argument and counter argument together in order to really encompass an argument. So things like this could be really exciting for students and for critical thought. So let a million flowers bloom. And I think it's really exciting, not just as a remediation to rote learning, but as creating a space for a new kind of pedagogy that is less exam focused and more collaborative, more peer-based, more group-based, and more dialogue-based, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. I should add, though, that Schoolhouse is part of many people around the world working on reimagining education. So we hope that our peer-to-peer online would slowly get translated into in-person models of small group peer-to-peer learning and discussions. And that's what we're working at. So this talk is very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarun. Now I would like to invite Momita for her question.
Hi, Durba again. Firstly, great conversation, very interesting conversation. I think it's a well-spent Saturday evening. So thank you for it.
Thank you.
So I actually want to circle back to one of Ashwin's earlier question and something that Sapin said right now, that, and it's not more of a question, I would want some advice from you actually. So our first year students, say our first year undergrad students, they come and there are some disciplines where we have to focus on technical skills. We have to teach them some technical skills. And sometimes they get lost in that. They feel that, okay, this is what we need to learn. And they forget that writing is also important. And writing is, if not more, at least as equal a skill that they should learn. So, and we have to realize that this is a generation of students who spend most of the time in social media like Instagram and Twitter, which has a restriction on the number of words they use. So they're not really very much used to writing. So, so in such a situation, how could we inspire or encourage our students to, understand the importance of writing, and of course, as well as focus on technical skills? So how to keep that balance? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's a really excellent question, and thank you also for this invitation. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. What we're doing at Asoka with disciplines, which every discipline requires a level of technical knowledge in order to produce anything worth producing in it. So you can't sort of, take your first year writing seminar and not be used to writing and then suddenly produce a reasonable paper in economics or whichever discipline it is. So what we've experimented with Asoka are two things which are working quite well. The first is a dedicated writing or thesis seminar. So once students, declare their major in their third or fourth year, they take a seminar which is now specialized writing. So you need someone who has the specialization to teach both economics and economic writing. And it could just be a question of disposition, someone who enjoys that process, who enjoys the writing of it, who enjoys the reading of it, who likes reading broadly. These specialized seminars work really well. Like student writing has gone up in quality. Students have become much more comfortable with writing. So I think that's one possibility. The second is a writing center, writing tutor in the center who's specialized in the discipline and also in writing pedagogy and writing pedagogy methods. Because the two things are related, but a little bit different. One is, the knowledge that you need to make an argument in the discipline. The second is, how do you write that knowledge out? And you need a person who's a bridge between both. This is quite new in the US. They don't have that much specialization in this. You're expected to what is called the learning by osmosis model. You're just supposed to know. If you're an econ major, you're supposed to know how to write an econ paper just through reading. So yes, actually going back to one early question, I don't know if writing has declined, but reading certainly has declined. You're absolutely right. Students read a lot less of, long detailed things, so that learning by osmosis is not happening. So they need someone to walk them through the steps. So you can hire this kind of bridge figure, in the discipline, in the department, and you'll find that the writing just goes up like crazy, because it can't be, every class can't do everything. It gets much better. And what's wonderful is this is sort of employment generation for so many young graduates in the field, which is not pointless. It's not worthless. It's actually very worthwhile. So someone who's just out of their PhD program, could just, with a little bit of training and interdisciplinary work with the writing center, be the person who's teaching these seminars. And, working across universities, across centers between writing and the disciplines, so much is possible. So, but you do need that specialized figure who's between both. It's very hard otherwise. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Momita. Now I would like to invite Ananya to switch on her camera and ask the question. Ananya, if you can.
Hi. Sorry, I'm not switching on my camera.
No problem. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Durba, hi.
Hi, so good to see you.
So I didn't have a question actually, but just a little bit of thinking about the rote learning. Ratta had made an observation, and so Sandeep had sort of caught me then and said, we'll ask later. So, you said, Durba, this whole concept of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think that's an excellent sort of thing to remember, because nobody can deny in this forum that rote learning and Ratta is a problem. And I just left the reference of Bhavani Raman's book, Document Raj, which has a wonderful chapter on writing and Thinnai schools and mnemonic learning. So this is like 18th century Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, that area, and how the British schools, the British purveyors are going to check out these schools and see what is going on here. And they report it as rote learning, whereas that's not what's going on. Mnemonic, and she sets out what mnemonic learning is. And it's far from what Ratta is. It is really, and you have parallels of this with medieval sort of those memory rooms, for example. How do you store huge amounts of information, and you recall them not as is, but having synthesized this. So what we are doing on paper now, for example, how you did it in your mind, right? So I just left that reference there, and I wanted to make the point that, and you made it also, Durba, that there are bodies of knowledge we need to embody and familiarize, right? That embodiment of knowledge has to happen, and that's not the same as Ratta. And from your own daughter's experience, you're saying that there's one kind of education that is happening in school that may not necessarily be embodying knowledge. And when these kids come to college, it's a different kind of problem.
Absolutely.
So I think creativity doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to embody knowledge. And I just wanted to make that point is all.
Absolutely. I mean, that point is really, really well taken. And another side of me, the anthropologist side of me also gets very conflicted sometimes between the writing and the educationist side of me, because there is an inherent violence to writing as well, right? In terms of its relationship to mnemonic traditions, bodily traditions, other ways of learning, and memory itself. Writing has a violent relationship to memory, and it has a colonial relationship to memory. When we look at societies which don't have writing and sort of what the Enlightenment education imperative did.
Yeah, in fact, in that same chapter, she talks about, so then the British needed clerks. who didn't need to understand English or what is, they just needed to copy letters. So the kind of copying that then comes into being in those schools, and our English school convent education is actually, a lot of the foundation comes from there. And so it's a beautiful book to sort of nuance it and understand that. And this violence that you talk about is located right there. So thank you for bringing that up, Durba. That's absolutely on point.
It's a violent relationship, absolutely. Of writing to memory and oral traditions. Yeah, absolutely. Very dark relationship, actually. So thank you. No, I'm definitely going to read the book also, and it would be wonderful if the audience also reads that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There is one student, Parth, who is not able to appear on camera, but he's saying that here's a question. He's saying that nowadays students are more into reading microblogs and short essays or short something. So how can we make the longer article interesting so that people can read? So, that is a very fundamental question, but he's asking. So he requested me to ask on his behalf if you have a response to this.
Yeah, Professor Kumar also, please. This is a difficult question and one that I've worked with a lot. So one of the things that I tend to assume is that students aren't going to do their reading. So my base assumption is they're not going to do their reading. And so then how do you get, and this has changed over the last 10, 15 years, right? So it used to start out with you assigned a reading, students would do it in any context, India or there. And now it's like the base is that they're not going to do their reading unless you actually gently bring them into the process of reading. So you're actually teaching people how to read, not how to read like words, but how to read a longer piece. So we actually start in many of my writing seminars or even anthro seminars with spending 3 weeks on one article. So if you don't read it and I try to make it the best, the most engaging, the article that students would want to read. So I really choose my pieces very carefully now. So to the earlier question about boring academic writing, I've been curating some of the pieces in my own discipline or in writing that really get students to read, that are beautifully written, that have big points of debate and argumentation. And then we might spend 3 weeks on one piece, right? And so if they don't read it the first week, don't read it the second week, by the third week, they've really read. Sometimes we'll just spend a class period reading something right there, working with chunks of text. But by the time they've gotten used to doing it for 2 articles, then the pickup is really quick. So you actually have to take that time to inculcate reading of complex texts as a habit very slowly over the beginning. Now, these things might seem like a waste of time from a technical point of view. Am I getting as many concepts across? Let's say in an anthropology class, I'm really not. I'm reducing the number of texts I'm assigning by a third or even more. But students are learning how to approach, and they're doing it slowly. And then by the 4th week, 5th week, by the end of the semester, they can approach 6 different articles and read them themselves if their interest is there, But you do have to do that reading work very deeply in the beginning of these classes.
Probably only partly seriously, I should share another strategy, because we are always coming up with these kinds of strategies as writing instructors, right? Is the great Indian tradition of the Ninda Stuti, that is, you berate the god and thereby create some kind of a stuti. Similarly, with my students, in a couple of instances, this has worked. I take examples of what Sapan would probably be aghast at, which is examples of absolutely horrible writing, and most of them come easily from the great post-structuralist, what we call the Poco-Pomo cabal, and there are many of them. And then just put up a paragraph there and see, and tell students, look, this is how horrible writing is. If you can teach this guy to write well, we would have really taught something to these people who are all big professors and getting money from public taxpayers and all that. And then they struggle, they start abusing the person in front of, the text in front of them, and they say, who writes bullshit like this? And to what end? At the end of the day, what does this guy want to say? I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm asking you. What does this guy want to say? And why does he say it so horribly? And finally, something clicks, something works. There is a keyhole somewhere in in a bad paragraph also. And then you start working against it. So you sort of, you work on the negative energy that you have produced against the article. You sort of use it like a fuel, a little bit like some of these cryogenics do. And then you see, you've already developed a certain bite. You want to teach this guy how to do it better. Now, what you write might not be better than the original, but you have at least begun to engage with this in a particular way. Now, again, these are not things you can do every day in a class, and these are not things that will work all the time. But there are all these different astras that one needs to take out from your pool, right, from your armor.
I love the idea of astras, because really getting students to read and teaching through opposition works very well. I think learning through opposing, but also the astras it's a constant battle, But you have to put the time into the reading and the thinking and the writing at really a micro level, and it pays dividends later.
Right.
So,
in fact, the only probably this anecdote should help us put things in context as to how not to stretch our experiments. I had this method of arguing for the morally simply unjustifiable standard in class, and doing a very good job of my task of it, which is, segregated classes in the US. I would argue is a perfectly fine thing, because it's the principle of separate but equal, or equal but separate. And there is absolutely no canon of modern law that is being breached in this arrangement. It's perfectly fine. Now, you have two options: either live with me, live with my argument and be a racist, or or oppose me. Yeah. And most often students start opposing you, and there's a great learning experiment there. The only problem was when we moved online, and I made this half of the argument, and I think there was some glitch with the network. So I'm left hanging, being the world's craziest racist, recorded on Zoom. So there is a limit to how much one can test these models, but it's really interesting to see.
But I also think you make a super important point about the classroom not as a safe space, but a place to test out argumentation in its biggest, most extreme forms. When we feel safe in that, we can do a lot with experimentation. When we move to other modes where there's more surveillance, or when there'll be a tech glitch, it can be very risky. So these classrooms are also These classrooms are also very risky places, are very intense places of debate and conversation. And I think that texture of like going from ratta to these kinds of conversations, it's really something very exciting. Yeah. And dangerous also.
Okay, I think now your daughter needs your attention, so we will let her have you.
Excuse me for 1 second here. Let me finish. They'll come soon. Okay, Babu? 25 minutes. Okay, sorry.
No,
this is
no,
the continual parenting thing with Zoom things. So,
Thank you, Ria, for pointing it out that the time is up. So I would request Ashwin to give his closing remarks, and then we can close quickly.
Sure. Right. The closing remarks are already, like, I think we all know what the closing remarks are, which is that it's important to come back to these kinds of issues every once in a while, because battling these large systemic issues, these are symptoms of large systemic issues, and it gets very, very, very silent and lonely inside the classroom, because although that is where the actual work has to happen, there's a lot of other things that have to change. There are a lot of moving parts to this problem, and just like sitting in a non-solutionist manner to even like begin reflecting on these issues is a great resource for both teachers and designers of curricula and larger institutional structures. And I think Durba has really initiated for us a larger set of conversations that I think we should begin at Ahmedabad University. And if I may say so, volunteer Durba to help us.
No, I think we all think across. It was such a pleasure. And, thank you so much for this invitation. It got me also to jumpstart a lot of thinking with all of you, with others. I think there's a lot that we can do to sort of change that landscape. And there's so much promise and potential. So I'm just super grateful. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Durba. Thank you, Ashwin. And thanks, everybody, for joining us on Saturday, late evening. We are grateful to you. Take care.